The other bucket that we do is what we call our housing access programs, and those are, we have three main programs. We have a VA-funded supportive services for veteran families, rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention program. We have a rapid rehousing program funded by HUD through the continuum of care that serves young adults. And then our most recent one that we started up last January is for unsheltered families, and those collectively probably serve about, I'm guessing, I should know this off the top of my head, but it's around 700 people. So altogether, Jericho serves about 3,000 men, women, and children every year.
Our board member, Cynthia English, told you a little bit about us, so I will just kind of fill in the blanks, hopefully. We are Care for the Homeless. We provide shelter, healthcare, and supportive services to individuals and families. We have about 23 service sites across the 5 boroughs, and soon to be 6 shelters in 3 of the 5 boroughs.
Good afternoon, everybody. How's everybody doing? Good? Good? You're awake? Fantastic. My name is Tara Loretta. I'm the Associate Director of Advocacy at the Supportive Housing Network of New York. We are a membership organization representing the nonprofits that develop and operate supportive housing throughout the state. Our mission is to support the sustainability and proliferation of supportive housing throughout the state, and we do that through policy and budget analysis, advocacy, outreach, technical assistance. I also serve as a member of the COC Steering Committee in New York City and the COC co-chair for the New York City Continuum.
Quite a distinguished group of panelists. We're really excited to have you with us today. I'm going to throw this first question out for anyone who wants to answer it. Brag a little bit about effective collaborations that you've been a part of that collaborate across New York City and the federal government. Share some success stories with us.
So it was mentioned on the earlier panel quite a bit, but the veterans homelessness work that we've done here in New York City is a great success story. It started really under Michelle Obama. She did a mayor's challenge to all the mayors around the country to challenge them to end veterans homelessness. And both Mayor Bloomberg and Mayor de Blasio put up on the challenge. And that really resulted in my 30 plus years of working in this industry, unprecedented collaboration between HUD, the VA, and the VA I think is the second biggest bureaucracy in the federal government. They're not always the easiest to work with because they have, I think somebody on the previous panel said it was a good thing that the HUD vouchers, which are these Section 8 vouchers for veterans, was part of the healthcare system, but that also presented a lot of issues because they see everything as healthcare and we see everything as like housing outreach and stuff. So, for example, they didn't know how to find housing in the community. So, Mayor Bloomberg, for example, personally met with a bunch of landlords in the city and implored them to house homeless veterans. He created a new department in the city of New York, the Department of Veteran Services. We had a veterans task force that was part of the continuum of care, and I see many people in the audience today who are on that task force. And we were able to, over a 5-year period, bring down veterans homelessness by 90% in the city. And it also included a lot of nonprofits and the government agencies. And as New Yorkers, I hate to say it, but we don't always play nicely. But this was a real collaboration. It was a meeting that you would look forward to going to because people would say, hey, I just got this rule relaxed, so it's easier for this veteran to get this voucher. Or hey, I just got approval to hire 10 peer outreach specialists. It was really really energizing and it really was effective. And I know that we had some questions earlier in the panel as well about, well, if you're focusing so much on veterans and putting all these resources into veterans, and what's happening to the other single adults and other families. And so that's definitely, unfortunately, we haven't really been able to replicate it, but it was really the federal government creating issuing thousands, tens of thousands of new HUD VASH vouchers, and that's what came into the city, and we were able to work with the VA to coordinate how those were spent, rather than just the VA kind of being in their silo. So I know I'm missing some stuff, but it was wonderful. And even today, we're still, the veterans homelessness is still down, so I think the figure was 136,000 homeless people in New York City. Only about 700 of them are veterans.
Not true.
So I think another piece that we need to talk about when we talk about collaboration with the federal government is actually the income support side of the ledger. And when we talk about homelessness and housing affordability, we tend as a sector to focus on how much housing costs, and that matters a lot, but also what other resources do people have and what their total income looks like is part of the equation as well. And in New York City, we administer, for example, SNAP benefits for almost 2 million New Yorkers and cash assistance for almost 600,000. Those are overlapping populations, but in total, there's about 3 million New Yorkers across all the different benefit programs that we operate. We're administering them here at the local level, but these are federal programs, and I think they aren't directly related to housing or homelessness prevention or ending homelessness, but if we didn't have them, the landscape would be that much more challenging. And I think it's certainly something that we need to be thinking about as we go forward. For those of you who may have, say, read the Washington Post yesterday with the threats to end state.
I'll just give quick comments. I don't know if any of you noticed, but obviously I have a great relationship with USICH folks. Jeff Olivet is in the room, Michelle Carver was here earlier. I got a call from a former person who worked at HUD, now works for the National Alliance to End Homelessness, by the name of Marcy Thompson, who told me that there is a new person that is going to be the regional director for the USICH, and I want her to talk and meet with me. So I get this call from Michelle about 2 years ago, telling me that Marcy Thompson told her to talk to me. You're a person with lived experience who has a lot of knowledge about what's going on in New York, and I want the two of you to sit in a room and have a conversation. So those conversations were enlightening to me as a person with lived experience. You think you can't work with government, nobody's listening, but as Jeff clearly said earlier, the more you get in those spaces and have conversations with elected officials, the more you get buy-in from those folks. So I'm kind of proud of the fact that I got to work closely with them and still continue to work closely with them. But I'll shout out another person from National Alliance to End Homelessness, Anna Lieber. When she used to come to our continuum of care meetings in New York, she would always pull me to the side, ask me a bunch of questions, and we formed a relationship. So I think it's possible to build off of these relationships, but you have to prove that they can work, and particularly for people with lived experience. You have to be able to open the door and say, this is going to be a good conversation. Come on in here and have the conversation.
I think that the federal government has done amazing things, but one of the things that HUD did with the continuum of care, which we'll talk a little bit about in more detail in a minute, is the requirement that nonprofits, mission-driven nonprofits, are the ones that are getting awarded the funds to do the services and provide supports. They are the ones closest to the ground, in the community, and know what the community needs. So that's one thing. And another thing that I think that has been wildly successful while still in its infancy in New York City is the coordinated entry system. So this is a requirement that the federal government has put down through COCs, that you have to assess and prioritize individuals who are entering into the continuum of homeless services in a coordinated way. So shelter providers and supportive housing providers and transitional housing providers all have to talk to each other. And what New York City has done is create the coordinated assessment and placement system, which in my experience is one of the most sophisticated, while again, still in its infancy, still has a lot of work to do to live up to its full capabilities, is one of the most sophisticated and robust placement systems that I've seen. And so I think that with continued resources and iterations, we have the ability to really create a robust system through the COC and CAPS.
As a healthcare provider, a federally qualified health center, as an FQHC, we are funded by HRSA, the federal government, to be able to provide care locally. And so connecting that care and partnering with DHS, for instance, and connecting with our co-located partners in the shelter system has been one of the ways in which we use the federal funding locally. But one of the things, and I see some BronxWorks folks, so shout out to y'all, our partnership with BronxWorks, where we have done MAT, which Bobby had mentioned, medically assisted treatment for substance use, opioid use. What we do is we go out with the street outreach teams, start engaging folks, start building the relationship, because one of our missions is to build long-term relationships, right, and not just episodic care. And so what we do is we start with Suboxone, and then build that trust, build that relationship, and bring them back into the health center to be able to engage in care. And hopefully, through that strong relationship, addressing things like hypertension, depression, anxiety, and cardiovascular disease.
Thank you. Since you all bring a little bit of a different perspective to this conversation, I'm going to jump in and ask you some tailored questions meant to elicit your unique perspectives and expertise. So Molly, I'm going to start with you, and this is going to be a question in multiple parts, so bear with me for a moment. How does New York City currently leverage federal funding to address homelessness? What adjustments or enhancements to the allocation of these funds are necessary to improve outcomes? And while you're at it, which federal policies or initiatives could have the greatest impact on reducing the number of people experiencing homelessness in New York City?
Could be here all day. All right, so with respect to the city's direct response to homelessness and you know, looking at the DHS budget and our sheltering response, the federal government's actually a pretty small share. Overall, it is, notes, it's about 22% of our sheltering budget. All of that, virtually all of that, is on the families with children side, where we are able to claim TANF dollars for those who are TANF eligible. You know, but New York City is a right to shelter city. We are providing shelter for all in need. So the size of our shelter system and the amount that we're spending on it is calibrated not to the resources that are available coming from other places, but to the extent of the demand. So that makes us very, very different from other places and means that the city is directly funding overwhelmingly at this point, almost $4 billion that is the DHS budget. I think if you look a little bit more broadly though at what the landscape of resources are that are used to address housing instability, obviously our federal partners play a huge role. You know, the affordable housing programs that we all depend on, whether it's supportive housing or affordable housing more broadly. You know, virtually all new construction in New York City is happening with low-income housing tax credits, right? That's not that is a tax expenditure for the federal government. You know, Section 8 plays an important role there. You know, the continuum care dollars are important, but overwhelmingly that's going into renewals. So really what we're seeing is that is sustaining investment that we've already made. The new investment in terms of housing programs, right, is really city capital combined with low-income housing tax credit and sometimes Section 8 vouchers. You know, again, sort of putting us in the, you know, talking about Section 8 vouchers. Section 8 is great. We really depend on it. I've been in this space a long time. We used to talk about how many new Section 8 vouchers would be appropriated every fall. That hasn't happened in a very long time outside of VASH. VASH is important, but outside of VASH, there hasn't been incremental Section 8 vouchers. We run the largest municipally funded rental subsidy program in the country, far and away the largest. The City FEPS program, there's about more than 40,000 households that are receiving City FEPS. So we are very grateful for the partnership from the federal government, and particularly on the affordable housing side with respect to the private activity bonds and the low-income housing tax credits. But really, the city has stepped up given the enormity of our issues. Trying to make sure I hit all the questions. There's lots of ways that we could change things to be more effective. I'm sort of not going to focus on the we would like more please, because even though we would like more please, I think it's not terribly likely to happen in the near term. But I think there's lots of ways that different funding streams could be made to work better together. Right now, most people who are looking for affordable housing are also receiving some other kind of benefit, but all of those operate in silos, right? So the fact that you have had income screening for SNAP, for Medicaid, or something else doesn't matter for tax credit or for Section 8 purposes, right? So we're all doing the same work and collecting the same information over and over again. And then there's lots of, in those limited funding streams that do exist, there's a lot of rules that make them really hard to use. Home dollars, which are available as a capital source, they're great, they're valuable. I certainly wouldn't want to operate without them, but they're also really challenging just because there's been a lot of really well-intentioned but additional requirements that have been put on them. Emergency Solutions Grant, another one that we are thrilled to have, but the fact that there's very prescriptive uses for that funding, and the level of documentation that we need to collect on things to be able to then claim on it is onerous on both us and on the individuals receiving the services. So I do think that there's, even without adding more, I would never say no to more, there are ways that we can make the different funding streams work better, both for those of us in government who are using them, but also for the people who are the ultimate beneficiaries, who are the ones who, at the end of the day, bear the burden of immense amounts of reporting. I don't know if I got all of your questions, but we'll let somebody else get more into it.
Thank you, Molly. Helpful perspective. Tiara, let's go to you. We know that in New York City, the city works closely with nonprofit organizations on issues around homelessness. How does federal funding flow through the city to support these organizations? And how can the city and federal government work together to ensure that these groups have the flexibility and resources to meet the diverse needs of homeless individuals?
Thanks, Judy. So we've mentioned here, and Bobby mentioned on the first panel, the continuum of care. So the continuum of care is a federal initiative through HUD that requires counties to identify a collaborative applicant in the community that will help to organize and coordinate the nonprofits that are applying for federal funds to support permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, rapid housing, and other programs throughout the homeless service continuum. What happens there is that there's an annual evaluation, and part of the challenge, I think, is that the nonprofits are competing against each other for these federal funds, and our ideal is to get as high as a score as we can, and then the COC is then competing nationally with other continuums to make sure that we're getting the funds in. So like Commissioner Park just mentioned, the COC brings in about $200 million annually that supports 170 programs in New York City, all going to nonprofits. New York is very unique, and just like Commissioner Park just mentioned, in that New York has such a robust system that supports the homeless service system that the COC funds are usually used to supplement other contracting funds, right, through DSS, DOHMH, HASA, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the challenges that we find working with the continuum is that the COC contracts, HUD has very strict requirements, is responsible for our prioritization of chronically homeless households and individuals, which is a great thing, but sometimes is a little bit misaligned with what we are seeing with the need in the community, but is also responsible for our coordinated entry system, which I mentioned before, the CAP system. But what the COC does historically is looking at their evaluation in an attempt to maximize their federal funds, so making sure that they're getting the highest score possible to make us competitive with other continuums throughout the nation. So they're making sure that nonprofits are, I'm going to talk about two key performance metrics here, but one is the chronicity, so making sure that folks are prioritizing chronically homeless households and individuals, which is a great thing. And also looking at, their occupancy, so making sure that we have a high occupancy rate. There's a lot of other performance metrics that go into the evaluation, but those are the two I'm going to focus on right now. So our COC, you get $1 of federal funding and you have to abide by all of their really strict requirements, but then we have all of these other contracting agencies that are involved that have their own requirements, and sometimes those two things are misaligned. So really what we need to make sure is that the city is recognizing that the COC is supplementing these funds and making sure that when we're doing our evaluation, we're taking that into account. And I know that that's one of the things that we're doing. I'll give a short example. Working with some nonprofit providers who have COC funds, again, supplementing some other resources, and a contracting agency like HASA sorry, I'm getting a little flustered here. So let me pause. I'm gonna give you a real world example here. A real world example of how the continuum and New York City can work together to make sure that we're all working towards the same goal. So, like I mentioned, COC is used to supplement some other contracting agencies and contracts through the city. And COC is looking at their program requirements and doing their own evaluation. The city is looking at their contract requirements, doing their own evaluation. Sometimes those two things are misaligned. So for example, the continuum from on high says that you are required to serve individuals who are chronically homeless. Some city agencies like HASA do not have a chronicity eligibility criteria. And so HASA is saying, we are going to refer anyone who's eligible to these units that you have contracted with us. But the nonprofit is saying, well, because I have this COC contract, I can only take individuals who are chronically homeless. That means, one, that the nonprofit is sort of sitting in the middle, and they are getting points deducted from their COC evaluation, they are getting points deducted from their HASA contract. No one's doing anything wrong. They're all just sort of working within their restrictions and requirements that they are aware of. And so one of the things that we did was to coordinate with HASA, get the COC in the room, get a representative from HUD in the room, and get some providers in the room to talk through how this is challenging. You're getting points deducted, you're in fear of losing your contracts on either side of the ball. And we were told through the HUD representative that while chronicity is a priority, it's not the only eligibility criteria. And I will say that this collaboration is really important because for years, providers were really having challenges scoring well on their COC evaluation and also communicating with HASA about the need to have what they deemed eligible referrals coming in. And there were high vacancy rates, and folks who needed supportive housing wasn't able to access because everyone was sort of working within their contract requirements. And so what we found through just simple conversations with HUD was that we were able to develop a letter that could go into a client file when they were making a referral that would designate or that would document that there were no chronically homeless eligible households that were identified, and that they can move on to the next eligible person. And so I think that level of coordination and communication and transparency is really important, and that the COC, although a small part of the pie, has huge ramifications for us, and the city recognizing that we're using this to supplement and that's taken into account when we're doing our overall evaluation and making sure that our coordinated entry and referral system is working efficiently.
Thank you. Tori, let's talk about rapid rehousing. From your perspective, how has federal funding supported or hindered the expansion of rapid rehousing initiatives in the city? And are there any federal or local policy changes that could improve the city's ability to adopt or expand this approach?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, Jericho has essentially 3 rapid rehousing programs, and they're all federally funded, and they tend to be very generous with what's called temporary financial assistance. So the idea of rapid rehousing, I'm sure most of you know, is that you take somebody who's literally homeless, and with these federal funds that you have, it means you can pay the security deposit, you can pay a broker's fee, you can pay their rent, or really, to depending on the program, it could be for up to 2 years. And over time, the idea is that the tenant will get a job, they'll get the benefits that they need, and then they'll be able to take over the apartment after 2 years or over, which is completely unrealistic in New York City because we're renting 2 bedrooms for $3,000 a month. We're using this federal money, which is very generous. Oftentimes the landlords are asking us for a double security deposit. Some of the programs allow a $1,000 landlord incentive grant, and I think that the people that we house is great, and they can get into housing rapidly. That's the whole point. And then we provide services for them. We provide employment support. But if you need to be making $100,000 to pay for your 2-bedroom, that's not that realistic. When I think the median income in New York City is like $60,000, $60,000 or $70,000. And not that we don't try to get those kind of jobs. And then I think what's happening at the same time is inadvertently, I think we're driving up rents and expectations. We have laws in New York City, at least I thought we did, where you couldn't ask for a double security deposit, but we pay them all the time because what my colleagues tell me is that, well, they won't rent to us, because it's a homeless person. It's like what we were talking about before. So I think there's it's very effective getting people. And I was just telling somebody earlier today that our unsheltered program that we just started in January, our average time to place somebody is 12.4 days. I mean, that's incredible to go from homelessness to your own home with the rent paid, in less than 2 weeks. It's really incredible, and it's obviously very life-changing, but I just worry sometimes about the consequences. And so, I know this is a little like off the question you asked, but I think the federal government really, we have such a big affordability crisis that without the help of rapid rehousing, us paying their rent, they would have no chance. And luckily, thanks to New York City, we're able to get a lot of them a voucher so that when we stop paying the rent, they have a subsidy. So it is affordable. But there's only so much New York City can do as well. So we need to build more housing. I think, Molly, you touched on it, that the home funds are very difficult to use, but the federal dollars to build new affordable housing is very complicated because of the prevailing wage rules, which aren't necessarily cumbersome because of the wages, it's because of the monitoring and the paperwork and everything that you have to do. So developers are choosing not to take federal money because their price goes up by 30-40%, is what I'm told. So I think it needs to be part of a broader thing, but the rapid rehousing is key, and it's very low threshold, but you have to have enough apartments available. And the 1.4% vacancy rate in New York City right now, that's not very likely.
Thank you, Tori. Jonathan, a question for you in a couple of different parts. So we know that people experiencing homelessness face complex health challenges. How does federal funding for health services align with the city's efforts to provide supportive services to individuals experiencing homelessness? And are there areas where this support could be improved? But while you're at it, what role does Medicaid play in delivering these services, and how can we better integrate Medicaid funding with local supportive services?
So as mentioned before, we are in a Medicaid expansion state, which provides a little bit more access for folks to get Medicaid, as well as a little flexibility for the reimbursement compared to non-expansion states. We still need more flexibility, although Commissioner Park won't say it, I would love more. And so, there's a really big part of that, because the efforts in the communities that we're working with, really, we're not able to keep up with the costs that it takes to engage our communities, right? And that Medicaid rate, while generous, does not quite get there, right? And so that's sort of one of the pieces. The other piece is, because the state is an intermediary, the 50% of Medicaid, as mentioned before, 50% federal, 50% state, you're adding federal regulations, city regulations, and state regulations on top. And as Sarah mentioned, they don't always match up, right? And so you're fighting against conflicting regulations in order to be able to provide services. And so we need to get creative and collaborative and all those levels, right? To be able to, instead of adding on, but sort of integrating some of those regulatory restrictions to allow us to provide the supportive services that we know that our communities need.
Thank you. And Rob, effective data collection is crucial for understanding the scope of homelessness. How might federal policy change if we had access to different data sets? How do you see data influencing policy decisions, and which policy issues would you focus on to drive change?
Let me start out by saying we do need more, right? I'm going to disagree with Commissioner Hall. We need more housing choice vouchers. Let's be real. In this city, there's a large section of society that's going to need rental subsidies, period. Right? City does a great job coming up with City Fest, but we need some federal government intervention. Send the housing choice vouchers our way.
Right.
We could definitely use them.
For sure.
I want to respond to Jody's question by piggybacking off of a lot of the stuff that Tiara said. So as you heard, I spent 12 years in the continuum of care. And people who work in the continuum of care give a huge time commitment and knowledge commitment. And some of us absorb knowledge and we want to make that system better because it is a competition. I gave 12 years, I didn't get a dime for it. It's not about the money. You want to see change around these particular issues. And something that I'm very proud of, before I went homeless, I came from IT. I worked for automatic data processing, the payroll company. So I care a lot about data. When you go into communities, people see data as surveillance. I didn't see it that way. When the HEART Act came about, which was an addendum to McKinney-Vento funding in 2008, the federal government says, we need you to start collecting data if you're a McKinney-Vento funded program. I was one of the founders of the Data Management Committee in New York City and believed in collecting this data and somehow trying to figure out how we send a better picture to the federal government. I don't want to criticize care providers. Care providers and not-for-profit organizations do a great job in the city, but there are many providers that are large programs, might have 20 programs in their portfolio. 2 are McKinney-Vento funded programs, 18 are non-McKinney-Vento funded programs. So the argument within the continuum of care was, HUD is trying to put these restrictions on us to put data into this portal, but why are they telling us what to do? They only fund 2 of my programs. Well, I think that's where we're missing out, right? Those 18 that aren't going into that data portal, the federal government doesn't get a complete picture of New York City, right? So we're taking a misstep. And when our mayor constantly says that he's not getting help from the federal government, but we need to do a better job. Care providers might have an argument, but we have several systems within the city and the different programs that is collecting data. Make those programs talk to one another. It's not that hard, folks. That's what we used to do back in my day at ADP. We made system 1 talk to system 2. Collect the data in one central place and make it useful to make the change that you want to see. So I think it's important for us to find a way, and maybe the onus is on the city and Commissioner Park, right? Right? To make our CARES program feed into HMIS, to make the DOHMH programs feed into HMIS. Then the federal government's going to have a better picture of what's happening in New York City. And I think then that makes the job easier for the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness to go back to the Hill and say, New York needs more support because they're doing this. Look at all of this data, right? So it doesn't seem complicated to me. I think what it is political will and people thinking outside of the box and stop pushing back. The federal government is not going to continue to give you money without putting some rules on that money, right? So they're going to give you a check every year for renewal, but they're going to put some demands on you, and that's life. So we have to deal with it.
Right.
So one of the overarching takeaways for me from the first panel was this feeling of optimism and empowerment around the power that exists at the local level to push back when you disagree with federal policy. So in the context of the external environment in which we are now operating, with the incoming changes at the federal level and at the presidential level, what are each of you thinking about as it relates to things that you're monitoring and how you're preparing for the next 4 years as it relates to ensuring that people who are experiencing homelessness get their needs met and continue to be a priority? Whomever feels moved to speak.
Sure, I don't know that I'm bringing a lot of optimism to the table here, but I think we are particularly focused on what is gonna happen with safety net programs, right? That is, while, as I said earlier, not immediately related to homelessness. If you take people who are extremely low income and economically vulnerable and make them more so, that is certainly not going to help the people's search for housing stability. So SNAP, for example, is up for reauthorization essentially immediately, and this is a place where we want to have a really big tent, right? There's a robust group of food advocates in New York City, right, who have done a really great job of talking about SNAP reauthorization, but you know, people who care about housing stability should care about SNAP too. And then I think there's a lot of you know, particularly vulnerable populations that we are going to be, that I worry about all the time. I think you know, difference between the first Trump administration and the next one for New York City is, right, that we have obviously a huge number of recent immigrants in our care, and I think that is a population that we're spending a lot of time thinking about and thinking about how we protect. But it goes broader than that. In the first Trump administration, there was an attempt to block trans people from accessing shelter, right? And so we need to make sure that any individual in New York City who needs access to care has access to the appropriate care, and that's something that I personally believe in very strongly and that we're going to be really fighting for. You know, I don't know if you want to talk about things that we affirmatively are doing at the local level and where I think there's opportunity, but we'll let that be a question.
We would never, you know, try to compromise your creative spirit.
All right,
So
well,
please.
in the spirit of being a little bit positive, I think there is a lot of things that we are doing at the city level that is really positive and encouraging. Right, the city invests an enormous amount in affordable housing, right? So while tax credits from the federal level are really, really critical, and we would be lost without them, the fact that the city spends $1 billion a year in capital funds on affordable housing is also incredibly important. I think City of Yes, the zoning proposal that is in front of the city council, I believe tomorrow, is incredibly important. It is not going to solve housing stability for the lowest income New Yorkers, but if the market can do a better job taking care of people who are moderate and middle income, then that frees up government to worry about the people who are most in need. And a program that I'm really excited about to be just entirely self-serving is the DSS Affordable Housing Services Program, where we have taken our city FEPS vouchers and project-based them into a 30-year contract. So it includes the rent, it includes the sub maintenance and operation funding, and some light touch social services. Not-for-profits who are getting that are able to use those contracts, leverage private debt, and acquire buildings. We closed on financing on those for 4 of them over the summer. One of them needed a little bit of construction. The other 3 are fully leased up, which for those of you who know the affordable housing landscape, to go from closing to lease up in a space of about 6 weeks is virtually unheard of. So that's something we're really excited about.
Piggyback on the diversity of the communities we serve and paying attention to that. I think is something that we, from a healthcare lens, are paying attention to, both with our gender expansive community members, TGMB, and migrants, but also how the isms and the policies of these isms affect our health, right? And needing to sort of keep that healthcare lens attached to how folks are coming in with more chronic disease, and being able to respond to that, not only supporting our staff who are experiencing trauma, but being able to deliver proper trauma-informed care.
Oh, I'm gonna take a shot here from about 50,000 feet up. Tonight, after I teach a class at the new school, I go out to JFK to get on a plane to go to Brazil. I was invited by the International Legal Foundation to talk about criminalization, poverty, and status. And I think with the new incoming administration, I think we're in for a fight. And I don't mind a good fight. That's probably why I walk with a cane today. I played football and wouldn't give up. Broke my hip every year of high school. Went my freshman year to Maryland and broke my hip and pelvis, and that was it for football. But I won't quit. I'm not a quitter. I think people's basic needs need to be met, and that looks at this work through a human rights framework. I think housing is a priority, food, water, and healthcare. And there are people not only in the city but in this country that go without those things. So it's incumbent upon myself, people in the International Legal Foundation and others, to really talk about putting together a strategy for the next 4 years. It's going to be a challenge. I'm not disillusioned, right? I've seen, I do a lot of work at the UN. I work with an organization called Partners for Dignity and Rights, where I'm a senior advisor here in New York City. And I think that the incoming administration is going to do everything they can to make the UN disappear. So it is incumbent upon all of us, if we believe in human rights, to stand up and say people have a right to housing, people have a right to food, people have a right to water, and people have a right to health care, right? It's only going to change when we all rise up, when we get rid of NIMBYism and say, this person isn't deserving, everybody's deserving. Just as Jeff said on the first panel, because of the fact that you're a human, you deserve certain things in this world, and that's a constant fight.
Right.
I'm worried about almost every department. I agree that the safety nets are very vulnerable right now, and the rhetoric that's in this country now is blaming poor people for the state of our country, which is just unbelievably misguided. I think that, together with the fact that the goal is to completely disrupt the, I don't like using that word, but to disrupt the federal government, and that together with misinformation is a dangerous combination. For example, and I might not have this right, I think it was Arkansas or Kansas, where they tried to put work requirements on public benefits, and it was a complete disaster. They had so many people go off the healthcare rolls, and so that seems like a win, right? But then folks still need healthcare, so they're going to the emergency room or whatever. So I'm afraid that there's there's so much misinformation, and so I think this is where we need to fight back. You talked about data. We need to have our data, and it needs to be reliable data. We need to be able to defend it up and down the line. And so I don't have a crystal ball, but I think everything is on the table, because the reality is they're going to pass large tax cuts, and they have to figure out a way to pay for it, because they don't want to increase the deficit. And they're going to do that by cutting Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, any kind of public benefit that they see doesn't help their friends in politics. That's a little cynical, yeah. But it's so my one hope is that there are so many good government people in government, in the federal government, and you can't get rid of them all. So we need to work at those lower levels. Maybe a little disruption of our own against the leadership government.
Just a quick response to what you said about the good people in government. We saw this movie before. Right? Being involved in human rights work, I work with some great people at the Department of State and different levels of federal government, that went to Geneva with us, right, to argue points. but once Trump won in 2016, I used to ask the question, were they hiding under the desk? It disappeared. So, I think that's something we have to think about, right? How do we keep engaged with those folks? Where are they? They will need our support also, right? Well, if they're gonna fight on the inside for us, so something for us to think about.
Yeah, what everyone just said. But I think that we've been fighting for marginalized people no matter who's in charge at the federal government for a very long time. We've been fighting for universal rental assistance, we've been fighting for more money from McKinney-Vento, we've been fighting for more money for STAT benefits. Sometimes the fight is a little bit harder, sometimes you're preaching to the choir and just trying to get a little, a little 5 cents, 10 cents, 15 cents where you can. But the fight doesn't stop. We've been doing this for a long time, and those of you who have been in this work for a lot longer than I have know that to be true. But aside from that, I think what we need to do as the city is make sure that our systems are in place, that our systems are working efficiently, that our nonprofits are solvent, and that they have the resources they need through their city contracts to be able to provide the services without reliance on the federal government. How are we creating more bureaucratic systems that make it difficult for them to get their funding? As a membership organization, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this, but a lot of our nonprofits are struggling because of late payments at the city level. So we need to get our house in order first and make sure that we are doing every single thing that we can at the city level, reducing all of it, as many administrative burdens as we can, to make sure that our nonprofits, without reliance on the federal government, without thinking about those restrictions, are able to provide the services that New Yorkers need.
Checking with my colleagues in the front row, should I continue or are we moving into Q&A?
You can do one more question if you'd like,
Okay.
and then we'll go to Q&A.
I think I just want to give anyone who wants to take it an opportunity to put out ideas of other things we can be doing across the local and federal government levels to help deliver for people in New York City who are experiencing homelessness. A lot of you shared best practices and ideas, but to the extent that there's something that you haven't shared, an idea, a thought, now is your opportunity.
So, I'm a big believer in the housing first model. I'm looking to go to Finland this coming summer to study their model. Helsinki, Finland has incorporated housing first since 2008. Homelessness is no longer a problem in Helsinki, Finland. I think there are also cities in this country that are doing a good job. And as somebody said on the first panel, how do we scale up, right? Dallas, Houston, Hennepin County, there's a county in, I believe, in Wisconsin. I won't say the county because I could be wrong with the county, but doing good work, right? By really pressing forward with this housing first model. While I believe in the providers here in the city, I think there are a lot of arguments between that are internal. I don't believe in the housing first model. A good friend of mine is sitting in the audience, Erica, says, we spent a lot of time in this country when you look at homelessness, trying to rebuild people rather than looking at the system that is broken, right? So we have to think outside of the box. And, I think the start for me is housing first policy, mandated across anybody that is receiving any type of service or any type of funding from federal government, local government, etc.
I think that we have to identify and have conversations about the different levels of care needed in our system. It's not a one-size-fits-all. For instance, we're co-located, and we have federally qualified health centers co-located in both our owned and operated and our partners' buildings and establishments and shelters, drop-in centers, etc. And we're restricted to staying in the health center to provide those services. We can't go on beyond those 4 walls. 1, we don't get reimbursed, and 2, our federal malpractice is not applicable outside of the walls, right? And so again, literally thinking outside of the box of our health center that are in these co-located areas so that we can provide different levels of care on the other side of that wall, I think is going to be really important moving forward.
has a very significant Medicaid waiver right now that will allow Medicaid dollars to be used for to address a variety of social determinants of health. This has been a process. What does that actually mean? What does it look like? How is it going to actually translate to services on the ground? And I don't have the answers to that yet. And unfortunately, you know, given the time that it has taken to roll that out and the end of the waiver, I think we're going to have a relatively short runway. But I also think it has the potential to be really exciting because it does address the fact that and does put real dollars to the fact that, you know, health is dependent on people's access to food, access to housing, all the things that you mentioned, right? And so if we can get this to work and if we all are working together, I think it does have real potential. You know, I think talking about data, that's a whole other, you know, conference, but you know, there's 3 designated social care networks in New York. They're all using 3 different databases. So, you know, it's gonna be a challenge, but it also has great potential.
I think maybe one idea that is, you know, a bipartisan, that was mentioned before, is the opioid crisis. And that is a health crisis, but we can also link it with housing. And I know I had breakfast with a colleague from the National Equity Fund about a month ago, and they're piloting, I think it was in Illinois, they're piloting housing programs for opioid users specifically. And so that might be somewhere where we can address a very bipartisan issue, because it doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat or independent, if you know, everybody's affected by the opioid crisis. And so that can be something that might be, you know, where we're focused to, yes, get more beds and get more treatment, more prevention, and more, you know, more medical treatment, but also let's, you know, think about how we can, you know, obviously your risks as an opioid user go way up if you're homeless, and they go down if you have a home. So that might be one idea that might be popular or palatable.
West Virginia is a place to look at that.
Yeah.
Well, the only thing that I would add is that we can't only care for people when they become homeless. We have to start very early on. I know that we're talking about policy, and I know Jeff earlier talked about music's prevention framework, but early childhood education, disrupting the school to prison pipeline, making sure that folks have you know, economic stability early on to really, really prevent the possibility of becoming homeless later on. And then universal rental assistance is something that we've been talking about, something I will bang the drum about forever, for as long as I can live. I'm a product of a housing choice voucher. It allowed me to get my bachelor's degree and get stability and go on to get my master's degree from an Ivy League institution. So I know the benefits. I can talk to the benefits of that program, and I will beat that drum forever. But really, from just an emotional and human standpoint, we have to start a lot earlier. And I know a lot of you are out here doing really good work for the clients and tenants that are in your supportive housing residences and otherwise. And some of those are families with children, and disrupting that cycle of homelessness and generational poverty is truly, truly transformational. So just starting from there.
Thank you for these insights, and now we're going to turn it over to some questions from the audience.
Great, thank you. Thank you again for submitting. We have a lot of good questions. So the first one is, how can the homeless response system better work with NYCHA to create more subsidized and affordable housing opportunities to New Yorkers?
So NYCHA is absolutely an important partner for us. They actually have opened up their Section 8 waitlist and are issuing vouchers for the first time in many, many years, and an allocation of those vouchers are going to individuals in the DHS system. With respect to public housing, we absolutely do coordinate with NYCHA so that people can move from shelter to permanent housing in NYCHA developments. That number is lower than it has been in the past, because NYCHA is actually doing some really innovative work to address their own very serious physical conditions, right? So they have large-scale major rehab projects going on, and are using vacancies to checkerboard and move people around while that rehab is happening. That is short-term challenging for us, but in the long term, right, if we lose NYCHA housing, like, forget it. It's, you know, that is incredibly valuable housing for the city of New York, and we, as people who care about affordable housing and homelessness, should want NYCHA to absolutely thrive. So, while right now it is the flow of units is a little bit more challenging than it has been in the past, I actually am incredibly supportive of all the work that NYCHA is doing. I will say that the number of units that we are receiving specifically for DHS clients from HPD, from that Department of Housing Preservation and Development, has skyrocketed. So, you know, we've blown through records every year for the last several years of the number of units that we're getting there. So, you know, housing supply is something that wakes me up at night. I think Victoria mentioned the 1.4. I'm not a very good sleeper, but the 1.4% vacancy rate. Like, absolutely, we have real supply constraints, and NYCHA is a part of that. But I'm also thrilled about the work they're doing to maintain their own stock.
So I think this is a role a federal government can play, right? Because while NYCHA was always thought of as a true social safety net, they're sitting in a place that's weird right now. About 17% of those apartments are vacant and in a state of disrepair, right? So we need federal dollars to bring those apartments back online. We know public housing works. Public housing has fallen around the rest of the country. Hasn't fallen in New York, right? Because we have 500,000 people living in public housing. So if they were all put out, where's that city gonna go? Because it is another city, right? So we have to reinvest, right? We need capital dollars to bring these apartments online. So that's, again, you know, we have our partners, USICH, that can go to the Hill and say, you can change conditions in New York if, right? Uphill battle, especially with the incoming administration. But these are part of the conversations that need to happen.
Thank you. What have you found to be effective strategies to provide care for people with substance use and mental health challenges?
In addition to the MAT program that I mentioned before, getting folks on Suboxone, having them feel better physically so that they can engage in a conversation and hopefully gain more care. We're in the process of expanding our behavioral health program to be able to be there at any point in anyone's mental health journey, right? And I think that that's really important. We very often, very similar to what you were saying about homelessness, respond to when someone's homeless, right? And so very often we're responding to when someone's in a mental health crisis, right? But if we can get them earlier into care, we can sort of hopefully prevent that crisis, right? And so it's really about not only going out and into the community and building trust in the community, right? Because trust is built. And then being able to sort of build on that to provide comprehensive care and integrated care, but it's also getting folks early before a problem is identified.
Most of the supportive units that we have at Jericho project are set aside for individuals who have a diagnosed substance use disorder. And so, you know, I know a lot of you here in the audience are providers, but the tools that really work that we use at Jericho, and I know a lot of you do as well. First of all, housing first is the first step. That you're not requiring people to have sobriety or be on medication. We've been doing that for a long time. We know it works. The second is to use some evidence-based models that I'm sure everybody's familiar with, like harm reduction, motivational interviewing. Whereas, you know, care used to be like, you need to stop doing this. You're hurting yourself. You're hurting your family. You know, yeah. And so, you know, you have to. I know that's the old saying is you work with people where they're at, and that's what's been really effective at Jericho, and I think really around the country. So, yeah, the system needs to be fixed, and we need to support people because they're the experts in their own lives, and we can't tell them what to do. So.
If it's okay, moderators, point of privilege here. I wanted like to just share very briefly a perspective on this. And it's a little bit about why I come at whatever's happening in our external landscape from a place of optimism. We still get to control how we show up and how we support the people we serve and walk alongside them in their journeys. And at ICL, we do a lot of work with people who are struggling with mental health and substance use disorders across a lot of different programs and a lot of different approaches. But I think the single most common theme when we're successful in our success is really seeing the relationships that we cultivate with the people we serve as part of the treatment. Being there for people who have been failed over years and decades by so many systems, continuing to show up and engage in the relationship. And that's something we can do no matter who's president.
Can you share what services are offered during transition from street to housing and how critical support is during that period of transition?
Sure, I'll start, but colleagues should chime in. So at the Department of Homeless Services, we do 24/7 street outreach. So some of that is city employees, more of it is working with not-for-profit providers. That is really about the same kind of trust building model that we've talked about in other contexts, right? Particularly in a right to shelter city, people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness have been failed by everybody, right? By family, by religious institutions, by government, by multiple levels of government, right? I mean, you name it. So there is a lot of engagement trying to convince people that coming inside is in fact a reasonable option. We have a variety of different models that we offer for those experiencing unsheltered homelessness. We have what we call our safe haven and stabilization beds. These are programs that are specifically for those experiencing unsheltered homelessness. They tend to be a little bit smaller and less dense than a traditional shelter, and they are accessed not through common intake, but through a referral from one of our outreach teams. It is a continuum, so I can't say a safe haven is never more than X beds and a shelter is always at least X beds, right? But they are generally, as I say, smaller, less dense, slightly fewer rules. But many people also go from the streets to the more traditional shelter system. It depends on what an individual's needs are and honestly what vacancies we have at any given point in time. A couple of things that we've done recently that I think are important in serving those experiencing unsheltered homelessness. We've added what we call our welcome center model. We have one in the Bronx, one in Brooklyn. The idea being that these are very low density settings that people can come to in the moment, right? So they connect with an outreach team, and if it's 2 o'clock in the morning and they're on the subway platform and they haven't eaten and they haven't slept, right? That is not a good time necessarily to be talking about what your ongoing placement is going to be. Let's get you into a bed. Right now we're using hotel rooms, although we're looking to make them more long term, right? Let's let you sleep and shower and eat, and then we can sit down together and figure out what the next step is, right? No decision made in that moment of crisis is necessarily going to be the right one. So I think that is an important model that we've added. And then the other piece that has been, I think, immensely innovative, even though very basic, is that we brought our streets, the team at DHS that handles unsheltered homelessness, we brought them into the housing conversation. And it used to be that our metric was, has somebody come indoors? And then, we sort of check at that point. But shelter's not the goal for anybody, right? Our goal for absolutely everybody is permanent housing. So we now have, when we have our weekly meetings on how are we doing on our permanent housing placements, it's the families team and the singles team and the streets team. And we're actually seeing, really tremendous growth in the numbers of people who are moving from sometimes directly from the streets, sometimes from one of the safe haven or stabilization beds into permanent housing. It can be supportive housing, or it can be just general market housing with the city PEPS voucher. It depends on what people need and what they want. But really record-breaking numbers there.
You have spoken about the government-funded responses to the homelessness crisis, but faith-based organizations and community organizations often stand in the gap. What coordination or funding is going to support these programs that often care for those who cannot or will not stay in city-run shelters?
Another one for me, sorry. So, good question. And now I'm gonna have to talk like a bureaucrat, right? I'm administering government money, and, you know, everything I do has to follow rules, and when we, you know, getting money out into the communities, getting people paid, making sure that we have a diversity of providers is incredibly important. But if I don't follow all the rules, then I, you know, end up in the newspaper for other kinds
I'm
of
done.
reasons,
I'm being
right?
shady.
And we've all
Not
been
being
there,
shady,
right?
Molly.
So there is, you know, we have an open-ended RFP, right? We want people to come to us. We want to work with the diversity of providers. I think one of the upsides of the fact that our system has had to grow so rapidly over the last couple of years is that we are now working with a range of providers that we haven't worked with in the past. That's a positive, but you know, I can't be in a position of saying, you know, yes, faith-based organization, you are doing good, you know, good community-based work, and therefore I'm going to fund you. But we have to follow the procurement rules. So I realize that is a frustrating bureaucratic answer, but it's the truth.
We receive city council discretionary funding for collaboration with faith-based organizations, and have a couple of faith-based organizations in which we are co-located. So going out to them, we have across the city we have such a strong network of resources, and faith-based is very much a part of that. And we are open to those partnerships, and continue to do the work that way.
What are the benefits of the data collected from HMIS and other systems?
Gives you the perfect picture, what's happening, right? Like, and I think one of the key takeaways for me when HMIS was first instituted was high rates of recidivism, right? Who was going in and out. And that allowed us to run interventions at certain stages to try to prevent those high rates of recidivism. But I just think data overall, depending on what you pick, it tells you who are these people, how long, who's chronic, you know, it answers a lot of questions that you might have, right? So it's so important, but it also sort of frames the issue in a particular city. And for us, again, as I harped on earlier, if we had these other databases feeding into HMIS, I think the federal government would have a better picture of what was truly happening in New York City.
This isn't an HMIS answer exactly, but a data piece that I think is really informative. We talk a lot about eviction, right? And there have been a lot of efforts to say, let's reduce homelessness by targeting people who are facing eviction. Well, in New York City, about 10% of the families with children entering the shelter system do so after a formal eviction. It's actually lower right now, but that's skewed by the numbers of recent immigrants. And in fact, something like 75% of the families with children who enter haven't had a lease at all in the last 2 years. 2 years is the number the time frame that I have, because that's what we look at, right? But overwhelmingly, the people entering the shelter system are, on the families with children side, are either domestic violence survivors or very young families who had been living, you know, with other people before they entered the shelter system. So without the data to know who's coming in, we don't know where to target that intervention, right? So if we put a lot of, not to say that eviction isn't a problem and that the housing stability issues associated with eviction aren't a challenge, But if we say we are gonna reduce homelessness by targeting people facing formal eviction, we're never gonna be successful.
So I agree with Molly, and I think something, I don't know how many of you know, New York City has something called an open data portal. It contains a lot of information. It might look like a bunch of puzzle pieces to some, but I make the argument that's how we got right to council passed. Because folks went into that open data portal, separated those puzzle pieces to pull out information just as Molly is talking about. And that gave people who work in the tech industry an opportunity to work with people who really are focused on getting people housed, working with legal services. Data is key, folks. It just, I'm gonna keep harping on it, but data is so key.
I just want to add something from the COC lens. I know, Commissioner Park mentioned earlier that the majority of the COC funds are renewals for programs that are already operating. However, there are some opportunities for new projects to come into the continuum, but that is all really data-driven. So, for instance, HUD has issued the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project, which allows municipalities and COCs to apply for funding that goes to support youth danger and foster care and other homeless youth. In the city, it was a highly competitive program, but through a needs assessment and data analysis, the city was actually able to get that grant awarded. Clap, clap, clap for the city and all of the people that were involved in making that happen. And then also through the DV pilots, right? So there's some other opportunities through the COC to get money that comes in to support survivors of domestic violence and their families. And that is all also really data-driven, although it's not through the HMIS system, but it's based on a needs assessment. So I think that data helps us, when all else fails, to actually bring in some additional funds into the continuum and into the city.
Tara, I think also with data, it taught us a lesson in the COC. We used to send money back to HUD.
Yeah.
Now we capture that money and we figure out what else we can do with this money, right? Into those new programs. But again, all data.
And your renewal is based on data through the HMIS work as well. So it really does matter. And for those who are not familiar, the HMIS is the Homeless Management Information System, which is the system that we use to transfer data.
All right, that is our time at the Q&A. There were several more, but that's what we have for today. Thank you very much.
Somebody else has some more questions.
Group of panelists, and if everyone could stay put just for another moment, Natalie is making her way up to help wrap us up this afternoon. Thank you again.
Wait.
Sir, this is not an open forum.
This-
You're taping. This is not an open forum.
I'm a veteran with lived experience.
Thank you very much. We've already
I'm also a journalist. Jody Rudin is pulling in almost $500,000 a year,
Way to go. It's time to
and
go.
they're treating our
I'm
veterans
sorry,
like
sir.
crap.
This is not an open forum.
How come DSS
Sir,
kicked
excuse
me off the Veterans
Excuse
Task
me,
Force?
this is not the point for this forum.
Where
Sir,
are
sir,
our lived experiences being heard?
Sir, I'm
This
sorry, you have to
gentleman
go.
and other people who have been in violent shelters, being assaulted, being underfed, and being denied access to housing resources.
I'm happy to talk to you outside after.
This is not the
That is
forum.
DSS that is doing that, and that is ICL that's doing this. You are doing this to our veterans in VA-funded programs.
This is not
You're
the
making
forum,
almost
sir.
$500,000 a year.
Sir, it's not the forum for this. Time to go. I'm sorry, this is not the forum for this. Please leave. Please leave.
contact that we've given you, and you've been able to talk today, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Where's our money?
All right, sir, sir.
Thank you all very much. I'm just going to close this out really quickly, a few closing thoughts. So thank you all for your participation
Am I
today.
being kicked out of the
I hope you
building
found
or
our
out
discussion
of
as
here?
Sir, I'm just
insightful and
asking you to leave
thought-provoking
this
as I did. We've covered a great deal of ground. There's a lot of information diving into very complex and often overlapping roles of federal and local governments in addressing homelessness. As we close, I want to highlight some of the few takeaways that I hope.
What did you take on the, I'm gonna put this in YouTube. This is just a cover your ass seminar where they are patting each other on the back. they're not taking care of the real problems. I've been in this system for 2.5 years without access to resources, without access to services. I'm a veteran with lived experience, and I was kicked off the Veterans Task Force for asking and questioning their motivations on veterans with experiencing homelessness. My name is Timothy Peña. I run an organization called the Veterans Justice Project and the Forgotten Veteran.
Tim, can I help?
So, hold on, I'm not finished. So you're saying that they are corrupt, basically, or liars? Which of the two?
That's not just me. Department of Investigation is calling them corrupt, is calling Department of Homeless Services corrupt, and the agencies that are taking monies from them.
How much money approximately?
There, $10.5 billion is missing, even
Wow.
more. ICL brings in $188 million a year, and they're paying their CEO off almost $500,000 a year to feed us like animals with cold rice and green beans, and then kicking us out of grant per diem programs and putting us in violent shelters.